Welcome to this special program brought to you by the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, supported by UN Women and UNDP, with funding from the European Union, Japan and France. I'm Spatisiwe Mpofu. I am joined in the studio by the Gender Commission's Chief Executive, Virginia Mwanigwa, as she takes us through the Commission's mandate and its role in the country's elections. Good evening, Virginia. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Spatisiwe. It is good to be here.
Okay, so just quickly tell us about your strategic role as the Zimbabwe Gender Commission in these elections.
The Zimbabwe Gender Commission is one of the 5 Chapter 12 institutions. We say Chapter 12 because in the Constitution of Zimbabwe, we appear under Chapter 12. And we are institutions whose responsibility is to enhance democracy and human rights in the country. So as Zimbabwe Gender Commission, as our name says, our responsibility is to ensure that the issues of gender equality are implemented as per the Constitution of Zimbabwe. We have several functions that we carry out, but specific to the elections, our role is to observe the elections so that as we make recommendations, we can make recommendations that enable our elections to be gender responsive, to be inclusive, and to also ensure that the rights of women, the rights of men are respected.
And so given the low numbers of women that participate in the country's elections, in what way can you say, as the Commission, you have made progress in promoting gender equality?
So as an institution, we are expected to make changes or to make progress in 3 areas. So in the content of the laws or the legislative framework of the country, or in the way the institutions that have to do with elections in Zimbabwe operate, and also in the way the people of Zimbabwe or the culture of the people of Zimbabwe respects also the need for us to ensure that there is equal participation. So in terms of the question that you've asked in what it is that we've done, we have actually been dealing with those 3 areas where we have participated as an institution in the review of the Electoral Act. We have also made our recommendations, not just to Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, but also to Parliament in terms of some of the key issues that should be addressed from a gender perspective. We have also interacted with various institutions, so in terms of how institutions conduct themselves. In this past electoral cycle, we have engaged with political players, so the political parties, some of the women candidates that made it in their political parties. We have also engaged, I've already mentioned the issue of ZEC. We've also engaged with civil society organizations. We've also engaged with Parliament to say that there are some things operational and administrative that need to be done to ensure that some of those challenges that will make it impossible for women to participate are addressed. And maybe I also need to explain, because I know that it's a question that's always asked, to say that we are the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, so why do we want to focus why do we seemingly focus on women? And we don't. What we do is we respond to the challenges on the ground. Which challenges, if we're talking about elections, show us that despite us having adopted a very progressive constitution in 2013, which upholds gender equality and non-discrimination, which also even speaks about affirmative action for historically disadvantaged groups, and which also upholds the need for diversity, also upholds the need for us to have equal representation based on different factors. We are still seeing that women as a social group are not equally represented, and this is tragic, considering that in terms of numbers, women are the majority, but we find that when it comes to politics and decision-making, women are in the minority. So part of the reason why we'll then focus on women, or seemingly focus on women, is for us to be able to ensure that we address where the needs are. In terms of the cultural aspect that I mentioned, we've also been carrying out awareness raising on what the Constitution says, also awareness raising not just in terms of the organizations or institutions that I've mentioned, but also even in communities where we've held community dialogues, where we'll just be talking about issues of gender. What do they mean? Why do we want to talk about gender? Why is it important for gender? And whose benefit is it for us to talk about gender? And contrary to what people believe, it is not just for the benefit of women. Because if we really look at elections, we are saying we need to find a way. This is our interpretation anyway, as Zimbabwe Gender Commission. We need to find a way as a country to make use of those resources we have invested in. We have invested in education for not just the boys but also the girls. We have invested in knowledge, in life skills as a country, not as an institution. And we need to ensure that when it comes to the issue of elections, not just men but also women are put forward for the people of Zimbabwe to consider. And hopefully as the elections also draw to a close, we see that both men and women are there, because it is very tragic if we find that we have institutions where you won't find one gender, or you find only one gender represented, because it means that in terms of perspectives we are lacking in the perspectives of the gender that is missing, which in this case is usually the women.
Okay. And so outside the electoral cycle, what other programs do you have in place to also educate, like you said, that women always fall short, to also educate women and boost their morale so that it can then motivate them to also participate in decision-making processes? Because sometimes madzimai anobatwa nekutya akuti, you know what, ndikazosimuka pamwe zvichazodai. How do you boost their confidence?
So as an institution, yes, we are looking at elections, but we don't work only on elections. And you also recognize that there's a cycle that goes, like for us, we also use the electoral cycle, the 5 years. But we do recognize that long before we come to the day of the elections, there are certain issues that need to be dealt with. Issues to do with our socio-cultural norms, which we know that despite it being so long after we got our independence, but also 13 years after we got the new constitution, we still have some people who believe that men and women have certain places where they should be, and they should not seek to get out of those. So part of what we've been doing is also to deconstruct some of those norms. How are we deconstructing? I already mentioned the issue of community dialogues. But just as an institution, in any event that we do, part of what we are doing is to start talking about what it is that we need to do to ensure that the constitution works. Yes, women are afraid, but we also know that even for those that are not afraid, there are other barriers that will make it impossible for them to participate. I think we saw that in this election, where nomination fees, for example, yes, others can afford the amounts that we expected, but when it comes to the gender dimension of it, not all women have the same kind of control and ownership over resources, even that they own as an individual. So you find that it may be easy for a man to say, yes, this amount is affordable and I can go for it. But for a woman in the same position, they need to also get whoever is part of their family cycle to agree. And I'm saying family because a lot of the times people will think it's the husband. It's not just the husband. It may be, if you are a young woman, it may be your father. If you are an older woman, it may even be your son. But what is important is to understand that it is not easy for the woman to just decide to dispose of resources as they want. So that's one. And then I already talked about the issue of the cultural norms, where there's a belief that women should not lead or cannot lead. But yes, we know leadership is difficult, not just for women, but also for men. But what is important is we need to start also building that critical mass of women in leadership. And we've done very well as a country since independence, where we've been having women in our various areas of leadership. Unfortunately, when it comes to the governance sector, we're not doing very well, because we need to get to a point where in parliament we have equal representation of men and women. We have done that in Senate, where the proportional representation system has ensured that we are almost near parity in Senate. But we know that in the National Assembly, that is still not there. So we need to ensure that whatever quota systems, whatever affirmative action we are adopting, is the type that then ensures that we have equal representation in politics and decision making. Other issues that we cannot pretend are not there are violence, sometimes our elections tend to be violent. And we know that violence does not just affect women, it can also affect men. But what is important is to have the kind of elections where violence is not a factor. And so we need to ensure that that is also there. We also talk about even the Electoral Act is okay, but one of the challenges has been that we see political parties going and presenting party lists to the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission that do not recognize that we should also have women on the lists. And we understand that there are even some parties that do not even have women. So that then creates a problem. And as Zimbabwe Gender Commission, part of what we've been lobbying for is to say that ZEC should be empowered to reject those party lists that do not show conformity with the constitution of Zimbabwe. I could go on, but there are so many issues. But what's important is we need to ensure that the elections of Zimbabwe give us an outcome that also gives women equal representation. I know that maybe this is not for this particular election, but in the long term as Zimbabwe Gender Commission, we've also been talking about even our electoral system, because the system whereby we say it's called first past the post, where the one who has the majority votes is the one who has won, does not necessarily also deliver gender equality. So in the future, part of what we are expecting as Gender Commission is a review even of our electoral system to ensure that we have proportional representation, which will also enable those that are not well represented to be represented.
Okay, and maybe quickly another issue that still sticks out is the issue of those with disabilities. And we have seen from this election that participation is close to none. How best, going forward, looking to the future, how best can we ensure that this certain group is also included in the political space?
So as a country, we've done well by saying we'll have a quota system for women in parliament, and then we also have a quota system now for the youth. And maybe some people may not know that there's some kind of also mechanism to ensure that people with disabilities are represented, including in parliament. But unfortunately, what that says is only two people, a man and a woman, will be in parliament representing people with disabilities. We understand from statistics, if I'm not wrong, that people with disabilities make up about, I think, 10% of our population. So two people in parliament is not representative. I think just as I said with the issue of women representation, we need to ensure that the actual direct elections will ensure that people with disabilities are elected on an equal basis with their peers and can then make it into parliament and other spaces just from that system. Because when it comes to now affirmative action, there is a limited number of people that can actually be considered. But if we were to have an electoral system that ensures that they are represented and can be considered by the people of Zimbabwe as they vote for whoever they choose, then would ensure that it is visible that we are including people with disabilities.
Okay, you also mentioned the issue of violence during elections. How do you intend to mitigate against violence during this election?
As a commission, our role is not so much to be directly mitigating, but to just raise awareness and to just also advise those institutions whose responsibility is to ensure that they do their work to prevent violence, and in the event that violence has occurred, to also take the necessary and legal action to deal with it. So it's an issue that we have already been dealing with. Some of you will have seen that we have put up billboards where we are saying no to gender-based violence, regardless of who's doing it, to whom it is being done, and why it is being done. We are saying we need to be able to have the kind of elections environment which is in line with Section 52 of our Constitution, which speaks about personal security and the need to uphold bodily integrity. So our responsibility is to raise awareness, to hold to account those whose role is to ensure that violence is dealt with, and then to also ensure that for those who may be victims or survivors of violence, they know what it is they're supposed to do if they have been.
Yeah, I know that when we talk about this gender issue, we can go on and on.
Yes.
But because of our time, we have to end it here for tonight. Thank you so much for choosing us. We are Star FM, sounding good all the time. This has been a special program brought to you by Zimbabwe Gender Commission, supported by UN Women and UNDP, with funding from the European Union, Japan and France. I want to thank my guest, Virginia Mwanigwa, who is the Gender Commission's Chief Executive. I am Aspatis Wempofu. Good evening.